You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute and is sponsored by the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. Hello, and welcome to episode 317 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. Our study of early American history has revealed that early North America was a very diverse place. It was diverse in terms of race and ethnicity, spoken languages, politics and diplomacy, culture, and religion. Now, in addition to the many indigenous religious beliefs and practices of early North America, early Americans also practiced Catholicism, different brands of Protestantism, and Judaism. Gemma Birnbaum and Melanie Meyers work at the American Jewish Historical Society, the oldest ethnic and cultural archives in the United States. They join us today so that we can explore the Jewish presence in early North America and the broader Atlantic world. Now, as we explore Jewish life in early America, Gemma and Melanie reveal information about the American Jewish Historical Society and what its unique collections reveal about early American Jewish life, the origins and backgrounds of Jewish colonists, and why they chose to migrate to North America during the 17th and 18th centuries, and Jewish contributions to early American history and the founding of the United States. But first, I really hope you and yours are enjoying this holiday season. You know, last year, Tim and I weren't able to gather in person with friends and family because of the pandemic. But this year, we're out and about because we're all vaccinated and we're really just enjoying the ability to see our loved ones in person. I really hope this is the case for you too. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this podcast, to learn from its expert scholars, and to share it with others in your life. During this period of seasonal reflection and thankfulness, please know that I'm thankful and grateful for you. And I really do wish you and yours the very best and a very happy and merry holiday season. All right, are you ready to venture into the world of early Jewish America? Allow me to introduce you to our expert guides. Joining us, we have two guests. First is Gemma Birnbaum, the Executive Director of the American Jewish Historical Society. And second is Melanie Meyers, the Director of Collections and Engagement. The American Jewish Historical Society is based in New York City and is the oldest ethnic cultural archives in the United States. Its collections reflect the history of the Jewish presence in what is now the United States from 1654 to the present. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Gemma Birnbaum and Melanie Meyers.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for having us.
Well, it's great to have you both here. And I wonder if we could begin by talking a bit more about the American Jewish Historical Society. Could you tell us a bit more about the Society's mission, why it was established, and about the wonderful manuscript collections that it has?
Absolutely. So Ajhs is the oldest extant ethnic and cultural archive in the United States, founded in 1892. So we are approaching our 130th anniversary next year, which is very exciting. And our mission from the very beginning has been to document the cultural and intellectual, political, but largely secular history of the Jewish people in the Americas, which started out as both North and South America, but the collections, just by nature of what was donated and acquired, really tend to skew more towards North America and the United States and the Northeastern United States in particular. But our collecting mandate is very broad. And as long as the material relates to Jewish life in America, it, has the potential for inclusion in our archive.
Melanie, are there any highlights of this collection or perhaps features of the American Jewish Historical Society's collections that really stand out to you as particularly amazing?
One of the areas that we have been very strong in from the very beginning of our collections is documenting the different benevolent and philanthropic organizations that sprung up in the American Jewish community. These relate to anything from Purim balls to fund local charities to large national organizations like the UJA Federation, as well as 50 years of Ajhs, which is the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, one of the oldest of such organizations in America. We have collections such as that. We also have a very, very large collection of personal papers of all different varieties, ranging from politicians, actors, sports figures. We really run the gamut. Having such a broad collecting mandate means that, again, so long as it relates to Jewish life in America, so long as it provides us with a window or a perspective that would be helpful and illuminating to people, then it's something that we would consider. One of the things that always gets a lot of attention because it is very special is we have a handwritten notebook produced by Emma Lazarus right at the end of her life, when it is not sort of the original handwritten version of the New Colossus, but rather it was towards the end of her life when she was becoming very ill. She bought a really beautiful marbled stationery book and sat down to write all of her poems in the order in which she wanted to leave them. And the New Colossus is the first. And so that's one of the first one that she put in order. So that's a really special item that we're very pleased to have. We've been collecting for close to 130 years. So we have 2,000 approximately collections, and it's really hard to pick just one or a few, but those are some highlights, I would say.
What about you, Gemma? Do you have a favorite part of the Ajhs collections?
Oh, yes. So I've only been here for a few months. I actually started back in July of this year. But I think my favorite thing that I've seen so far is Sandy Koufax's baseball jersey that Melanie pulled out during a tour. Seeing that in person was really, really exciting.
Yeah, that is a fantastic item. People, I think, are very surprised to find out that we have a large collection of sports memorabilia, largely baseball, largely because of two people who are Sandy Koufax and Hank Greenberg. But Jewish participation in sports is a really important part of American history as well. And so we would be remiss to not have materials that are related to that.
It's really interesting to hear about the different collections that the American Jewish Historical Society has, because when I read about Jewish history in the United States and I talk to people about this history, there seems to be this assumption that Jewish history in North America is really something that begins in the late 19th or early 20th centuries. And yet, Melanie, you were just discussing all the philanthropic collections that the American Jewish Historical Society has that really predates those years. And in my own research about the Bunker Hill Monument, when I worked there as an interpretive ranger for the National Park Service, you have Judah Torah, who's this American-born Jew who donates the money that is really needed to complete this monument during the early to mid-19th century. And there's really a history that long predates this example that I've given you. So there really is a very long history of Jews living in North America.
I think the misconceptions around when Jews came here, I think a lot of it, there's this assumption that it's all people from Europe right before World War II or after World War II, which is a significant number, or that it was during the 1880s when it got really bad in Poland. And again, that's also a wave of immigration to the United States and other countries for Jews. But, you know, as long as the United States has existed, and even before, Jews have been there.
Yes, that's absolutely correct. And one of the things that I always found interesting is when we've done groups with students about Emma Lazarus and they talk about the poem and give me you're tired, you're poor, students always assume that she was an immigrant. And that is totally incorrect. And in fact, her family had been here for 4 or 5 generations at the time of her birth. So yes, the Jewish presence in the Americas has been here since before we were called the United States.
So when does the long history of Jews in the Americas begin? Could you tell us about the arrival of Jews in early North America and about the documents and collections that the American Jewish Historical Society has that reveals details about these early American Jewish communities?
Yes, absolutely. So most of the material that we have here about the colonial era comes from this large selection of family papers. So these are letters, diaries, a lot of them are financial records, ledgers, account books, that kind of thing that really gives us that window, that perspective onto Jewish life in the colonies. So collections of people like, say, Aaron Lopez, whose family came from Portugal and relocated to the British colony here, settling in Newport, Rhode Island, later Massachusetts. People like the Franks family, they were originally from England and they were colonial merchants who settled here in New York City in the early 1700s. There's the Levies, who were in New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. But one of the things that collection contains that's very interesting is it's a letter of renunciation of allegiance to King George III, which was written right on the cusp of the American Revolution. So there's also correspondence, continental currency, wills, So a lot of it is from the personal papers of people that thankfully that these family histories and genealogies and family items were preserved by the families and then later acquired by scholars, by collectors, or were gifted to the Ajhs by families. So that's really how the material around the colonial period and the revolution is represented within the collections here. It's through the prism of these specific families who, for the most part, to be fair, are very affluent families. These are people who could write correspondence, who had financial means large enough to be creating account books and records or enough property that they had a will. So it's a somewhat selective view, but a very important and illuminating one nonetheless.
Do we know when the first Jewish people or families like the Levis, the Lopezes, and the Franks started to arrive in the Americas?
We do. So, Melanie already mentioned a couple of individuals. And so there are several individuals who settle in early America on their own. But 1654 is when the first group of Jews arrive as a group, not just as individuals. And so this includes about 13 children. So it's really only 10 adults. So it's a really small number. And they come from Dutch Brazil and settle in New Amsterdam, which is what we would now say is the southern tip of Manhattan, just a few blocks from where Melanie and I are recording this, actually. So they had fled to New Amsterdam after the settlement in Recife was conquered by the Portuguese. And so they're really afraid of an inquisition. And so they're Sephardic families. And so they come, it's 23 of them. And that's really what starts this colonial wave of migration. And when we say wave, it's still very small numbers, but it's certainly more than just the 3 or 4 Jews that were in early America before this group got there.
Do we know why these Jewish families came to the Americas? Did they come for land, for money and trade, religious freedom? What prompted Jews to make their homes in the Americas during the 17th century? What was the pull factor?
I think a lot of it was religious-based and really circumstance. And there's instances of Jews attempting to enter the colonies and being turned away. And we see that repeated in history as late as the Holocaust and the St. Louis being turned around, and not allowed in. So it's definitely sort of twofold. It's fleeing this religious persecution or this fear of these inquisitions. But there is also this economic opportunity that's supposed to be coming through this settlement in these new, supposedly undiscovered regions. Of course, we know that there were people already living there and they had their own economies and their own communities. But that's really what is driving them. And they're met with a resistance from local merchants. So it's not like these Jews, and particularly these 23 that start in 1654, that start this wave, it's not like they are immediately welcomed and everything is fine. But it's sort of this comparison of like, well, it's better than the Spanish Inquisition. It's better than the Portuguese Inquisition. And so when they arrive, they were already turned away from Spanish-controlled Jamaica and Cuba. So they're entering New Amsterdam, are all but greeted by the governor, at the time was Peter Stuyvesant, trying to expel them. And so he's sort of forced to let them in, but not before calling them repugnant and deceitful. And so they're looking for this haven as well as this economic opportunity, but it's not necessarily given to them very easily. And so they are told they can stay, and, Peter Stuyvesant can't expel them or kick them out. But this already starts the relationship off and the experience off in this really contentious way. So they come from Recife and these other regions in Brazil. They are what we would call Sephardic Jews. So I think that's just important to note that the first Jews that enter the American landscape, they're of Sephardic descent.
I'm really glad you brought up that the first Jews in early North America were of Sephardic descent, because Sessa has a question about the backgrounds of the Jews who settled in early America. She specifically would like to know what percentage of the Jewish settlers were Ashkenazi, Mizrahi, or Sephardic. So Gemma, could you tell us a little bit about these different Jewish backgrounds and which group was predominant in terms of Jewish settlement in early North America?
It's a really good question. So the vast majority of the Jews who come to early America are Sephardic. So they fled places like Spain, Brazil, and Portugal. They are also coming from places that we would consider Mizrahi Jews in present day. So the term Mizrahi actually comes about after the creation of the state of Israel. So in 1654, nobody's calling themselves that yet. They're just considering themselves Sephardic. But they come from North Africa and Western Asia. And so that's a smaller group that comes to early America, very small. And it's later than the Sephardic communities that have been forming. And so I think Ashkenazi is really referring to people from Central and Eastern Europe, Jews from Central and Eastern Europe. And so their presence is not significant in the region until probably the 1840s. They're less commonly migrating to the Americas before that. And I think it's really interesting because I think there's an assumption that all of these Jews were coming to places like New Amsterdam and what we would consider the modern day United States and Canada. But in reality, the oldest and longest continually operating synagogue is located in Curacao, which is about 40 miles north of Venezuela. So we're seeing this presence, but they're not just gravitating to New Amsterdam or to Newport, Rhode Island. They're gravitating to a lot of these different areas in the Americas as a whole.
What I find so interesting about the information you just shared with us about the Sephardic Jews who were settling in the Americas is that these Jews were migrating to places like Recife, Brazil, Curacao, New Amsterdam, and New Netherland. And of course, these are all Dutch colonies. So Gemma, what was it about these Dutch colonies, do you think, that prompted Portuguese and Spanish Jews and Jews from North Africa and Western Asia to migrate to the Dutch Atlantic world?
It's where they could go. And I think when you look at the amount of land that the Dutch control at this point, it's very difficult, especially if we're following some of these migration patterns, to essentially not end up in a Dutch-controlled colony. And they're turned away from Spanish-controlled colonies because of the anti-Semitism in these communities, in these countries, in these cities. And so I think a lot of it is just this is where they're allowed to actually enter, whereas some of these other places like Jamaica and Cuba are not allowing them in.
You also mentioned that Peter Stuyvesant, the governor of New Netherland, had allowed Jews to settle in New Amsterdam and New Netherland, but he didn't exactly make it easy for Jews to resettle and create new lives there. And Leslie, Daniel, and Stessa all have questions about what everyday life was like in Jewish communities in early America. So, Gemma, could you talk to us a bit more about the challenges early Jews faced when they attempted to settle in early North American places like New Amsterdam?
It's really interesting. Their communities mimic a lot of what you would see in Protestant communities and others. They are not necessarily wearing different garb or outfits. So I think that's a really big distinguishing factor in determining how you can identify Jewish communities sometimes in history. We even still do that today, even here in New York City. And so they're blending in. I wouldn't go so far as to call it assimilation, because I think that has different connotations than what we're talking about here. But by and large, the communities were made up of the same kinds of jobs, clothing. They wanted to start families. Like, they're really mimicking a lot of what the Protestants and others had already been doing in early America. And so everyday life, it was good for some, especially some of those who had wealth. It was pretty terrible for anybody who didn't. It's dirty. The hygiene is not the best. Some of these jobs are really dangerous and difficult. And so I think what's actually really cool about the Jewish story is that it is representative of, I think, the early American story. They're having this experience the same way that others do. They just have this sort of different history behind why they're there. And of course, then they have people like Peter Stuyvesant who are trying to get rid of them. And, at one point, Ulysses S. Grant tries to expel Jews from Western Tennessee. This is not a group that's necessarily super welcome, but nonetheless, they're finding jobs, they're finding communities, they're building synagogues, and they're making homes for themselves. And I think that's really what the everyday was about, was finding a job, making your family, and just trying to live free from some of this tyranny that they had been experiencing.
It really does sound like Jews fit right into early America. They don't sound like a people who did much to stick out. Did Jews establish and settle in Jewish-specific neighborhoods or communities, as we try to picture this in our mind? Or did they really just filter right into the existing communities and integrate themselves into what was already there?
There's definitely unique communities. Some of the most, I think, heavily populated in terms of Jewish community, which again, we're talking about maybe a few dozen families at most in some of these areas. Memphis, Tennessee is one, which is partly what prompts Ulysses S. Grant in the 1800s to try to expel them. Charleston, South Carolina, at one point has the largest Jewish population in the early Americas, which I don't think a lot of people really realize that. Newport, Rhode Island, like Melanie mentioned earlier, is a really important home base for them. And New York City is, even still today, has a really significant connection to Jewish culture and community. And so they really are creating their own communities while still sort of existing in this larger economy. Philadelphia is another one. There's a lot of Jews that settle in Philadelphia. And I think that makes sense when you see where commerce is burgeoning, where government is starting to really happen and take shape. That's where people wanted to be. And so that's where they're gravitating to as well.
Daniel wonders about the structure of early American Jewish communities. So what would it be like if we had the opportunity to, say, time travel and to walk through one of these Jewish neighborhoods in, say, early Charleston, South Carolina, or New York City? What would our experience be? How would this community that we're walking through be structured?
I think about this a lot because I feel so grateful to have been born in the era that I was so that I don't have to walk through an early colonial Jewish settlement or other place, because for the most part, they're pretty rudimentary. I mean, you're starting over. And again, we're talking about really, really small numbers. So they're finding this community and they're forming things like businesses and building houses and building their synagogues. But you're also really keenly aware of the fact that you're one of maybe 90 or maybe 30, depending, on where you are. And so walking through, you'd typically see children playing, and some of those children worked in the family businesses, which I think is common in that era, regardless of whether you're Jewish or not. But it was definitely very common in Jewish families. So even from that very first group of 23, like I said, only 10 were adults, 13 were children. And a lot of those children were put into these roles and had to both help support their families while also trying to be educated. They don't necessarily have established schools yet. So a lot of what they're trying to figure out is how to educate those children as well. But I think about the way that places like Colonial, Williamsburg, and others operate. And I think for a lot of those Jewish communities, it was very similar. I mean, you can kind of get a sense of what they were going through. It was a bit more difficult for them to just practice their religion because they didn't have these places like synagogues yet. So it just feels like this sort of great experiment of trying to figure out how to become and how to maintain your Judaism in this new world.
For what it's worth, I'm also grateful that I was born in the late 20th century because I really have no interest in experiencing the smells of early North America.
Oh, yeah.
Now, Gemma, you raised a really interesting point about how Jews might have practiced their religion and the struggle to try and recreate their religious community in these early American places. Melanie, do the family papers within the American Jewish Historical Society's collections reveal any information about how Jews practiced their faith in early America? And I ask because I'm thinking of early New York here, and the Dutch had a policy of religious toleration, which meant that people could practice their non-Dutch Reformed faiths in the privacy of their own homes. But that toleration really didn't extend to any sort of public worship of non-Dutch Reformed Protestantism.
Well, certainly within the collections, within these family collections, there are substantial amounts of religious books that were passed down within these families that often contain genealogical information. We also see things like marriage contracts, the religious marriage contracts, which are featured prominently in many of these family collections. And I mean, we also do have limited material about some of the early synagogues as well. We have a very small collection related to the first synagogue in Charleston, either Charleston or Savannah. We also have some collection materials about the famous synagogue up in Newport, Rhode Island. So it's not as if we have detailed information about what exactly was happening at the services, about what sort of individual practice was, but these are people that were clearly practicing their religion. And it was also a very important function of community as well. I mean, the synagogue serves a very similar function as does the church. In Protestant communities, it's not just a place for religious worship, but it's also a place for community and discussion and for addressing the greater needs of the community. And so we do see that reflected in the family papers, but not in a very granular sense, I would say.
Do we know when these early synagogues in Charleston and Newport began to appear on the early American scene?
I mean, a lot of them are built right when the Jews first start to arrive. And not all of them are as what I would call established or official or ornate as somewhere like Torah Synagogue in Newport. And they don't need a lot. Again, you're talking about maybe 30 families. So they establish these synagogues and really they're typically right near their homes. And it's like Melanie said, they serve as this sort of place of congregation and not just worship. It's a city center, essentially, for a lot of them. And so these are built very early on in the colonial era. And the fact that some of them are still standing today and still exist today, like you can go to that synagogue in Curacao and it's one of the most common tourist attractions and take a picture of it and it's still standing. And so I think it goes to show how critical these were to the community, that they were one of the first priorities and that they're still being maintained today. largely by still very small Jewish populations. I mean, in Curacao, it's 350 people, and they all still use the synagogue and maintain it and worship there.
Yeah, we have records from a few synagogues in and around the Caribbean, one in Barbados, I believe, and those are all 18th century records. Yeah.
I'd like to talk about marriage for a moment. Melanie, you mentioned that the American Jewish Historical Society has marriage contracts in its early family papers. And Daniel wonders in what ways early Jewish communities used marriage as a tool to make connections within their own communities, within the broader Jewish Atlantic world, and even outside of the Jewish communities in places like New York City, Charleston, and Newport, Rhode Island.
Gemma's probably a bit more prepared to answer this one than I am. She just knows a bit more about it. But certainly, I mean, marriage in this time period is obviously used to make connections, but in the Jewish community, it was largely staying within the Jewish community. You're not seeing great instances of intermarriage. In one of the family collections, in fact, which is the Franks family collection, one of my personal favorite collections here, there's extensive correspondence between Abigail Franks and her son, who had been sent to England to run the family business. He'd been educated there and to sort of be their liaison between the business interests here in America and what was happening there. In one point in the letters, Abigail's very upset because her daughter, the guy she's writing to, sister, has eloped with a member of the Delancey family. So not a Jewish family. Oliver Delancey, I believe it was. I'd have to go back to the letters to get the exact name. But this was, of course, a great consternation to Abigail because she had not only eloped, but she had eloped with someone who was not Jewish. And this was really extremely upsetting for the family because obviously I think they had hoped that she would marry someone within, that American Jewish community as well. But Gemma may have a little more to say on that as well.
Yeah, just a bit more. Arranged marriages were really common, and this was largely for economic reasons, which I don't think is surprising. The vast majority of Jews and Jewish women, were poor and struggling to maintain households or support themselves if they were single. And so these arranged marriages allowed for families to combine resources, especially if they ran businesses, if they had other children, cousins, others to take care of. The arranged marriages allow them to do that. I also think it's really important to note, and Melanie kind of touched on this earlier, most of the records of the experience of Jewish women in particular around marriage and their role in the community is from the perspective of the wealthier women because they had the education and resources to have diaries and to document. And they were deliberately documenting a lot of this because they knew it was historic. Women of certain means are going to be much more represented than the vast majority who were struggling when they got there. I mean, this is a very hard life. And so seeing some of these documents, both in our collection and in others, we sort of know that it's not necessarily completely representative of the full Jewish colonial experience, and particularly for women.
Did Abigail Franks and her family ever forgive her daughter for eloping outside of the Jewish community? I mean, in reality, if we're looking about economic circumstances, marrying into the Delancey family, while it was not a Jewish family, was kind of a power move in the mid-18th century because they were a wealthy mercantile family and they had a lot of connections within colonial New York government.
It does not say. It is a very small collection. It is of the Franks family. And Abigail's letters to her son were saved, but actually none of the letters that her son wrote back to her, for the most part, were. So these things were saved in a very ad hoc way, I would say, what family members chose to pass down, what things survived. And this is the case in virtually any archive. You rarely get the full story. I mean, what an archive really is it's a collection of perspectives. And so we're seeing, Abigail's perspective to her son, so upset about her own daughter who's now married outside the family. But we don't really see what the wider family thought of this. Maybe it was just Abigail who was upset about it. I highly doubt that. But we don't really see the full picture of the family dynamics or what the larger community must have thought about this.
Considering the different points of views and the voices that we find in archives is really important. We speak with a lot of historians on this podcast, and many scholars who study enslaved and free African or African-American history or indigenous history will tell us that they have to use white sources and the sources of the wealthy to really get at the people and voices who are so underrepresented in archives. And Gemma, you mentioned a bit earlier that what we're really looking at when we look at the American Jewish Historical Society's family papers is early American Jewish history through the eyes of the wealthiest members of these Jewish communities. Do you think that there are ways that we can look at these collections so that they can tell us something about the broader Jewish community and how everyday non-wealthy Jews would have experienced life in early America?
I think it's all about interpretation. And a lot of the documents, and this is, again, true of both the things that are in our collection as well as just archival research in general, you kind of have to read between the lines of what's being said. You have to kind of look and see where they're mentioning things like servants or enslaved people or others. And it's usually very casual. And so you're sort of building this narrative around what's sort of not being said. And then there is enough documentation, I think, that you can sort of fill in what's happening. There's less, but there's not no documentation about what poor Jewish women were doing in colonial America, for example. It's harder to find. It was harder to collect, but it does exist. And I think between all of the sources, you can start to build a narrative around how the average person would have lived during this time. And I think what's beneficial to, especially the study of American Jewish history in this era, is you do have a lot of documentation from non-Jews as well, who are sort of documenting their interactions with Jewish people, sometimes not very positively, but at least you've got this record of it. It also can demonstrate the anti-Semitism that they might have experienced. And so there's such a plethora of artifacts and objects and documents from this era in general that you can sort of build this narrative around what Jewish life was like through what we have, through what other archives have, and just putting it sort of into context with that historiography.
To turn south in our conversation, Gemma, I think you mentioned earlier that Charleston had a very vibrant early American Jewish community. And Marie wonders about the Southern Jewish experience and how that experience may have differed from the Northern Jewish experience. So could you talk to us a bit about what life was like for Jews in the Southern British colonies?
I love this question because I spent 12 years living in New Orleans, and I feel like I got a modern day version of what it's like to be a Southern Jew for at least a decade of my life. You know, they established communities in the early American South in decent numbers. And so we've already mentioned, Charleston, Savannah, Memphis. There's also Wilmington, North Carolina, and Charlottesville, Virginia. Major cities, smaller towns alike. There's definitely a distinct Southern Jewish identity that starts to form here. Their experience is very different from the Northern Jews. The Northern Jews are not necessarily spending as much time, in farmland and other things as Southern Jews, although there are farms up in modern day Queens. Of course, then it was something different. And so they're having a really different experience than the Jews who are settling in New Amsterdam or other areas like this. You can see that in the dialect and the way that they start to pick up, language from other people. I mean, you're talking about a Cajun influence, a Creole influence, and all of this still, it's around then. I mean, it's some of the oldest culture that we have in the Americas. And so they're being influenced by that dialect, by the food. Jewish food in the South is both very similar, but also kind of different from Jewish food in the North. And it takes from those local communities and sort of becomes, a really nice sort of mishmash of cultures, I think, and occupations, are different. They're also able, I think, to adapt to the culture of the South in a way that maybe Jews in the North didn't necessarily have that opportunity. And it doesn't mean they hid their Jewish identity. They developed this culture that is both Jewish and also distinctly Southern. And so, in the mid 1800s, the largest Jewish community at that point, the States, is Charleston. It's in Charleston. And so I also think this is a perfect time to maybe shout out our colleagues at the Museum of the Southern Jewish Experience in New Orleans that recently opened. They have exhibits that cover Jewish life in the South from the very first colonists through the slave trade and the Civil War, all the way through the World Wars, in the sort of post-war civil rights era. And so I think if anybody's looking for a source on more about that, that's a really excellent resource for people to find out about what it was like to be Jewish in Charleston or in Charlottesville, Virginia, or any of these places in 1790, because it was a very different experience than it was in the North.
When we think about the early American South, I think many of our minds automatically evoke a picture of plantation agriculture. And you mentioned that Jews were highly involved in the Southern agricultural economy. Did this involvement extend to the practice of slavery? Was there any Jewish idea or doctrine that informed whether participating in the practice of slavery or in the slave trade was permissible for Jews? And I'm thinking about this in terms of Quakers and how early on there were a lot of Quakers who were engaged in slavery and the slave trade. But then their faith demanded that they stop this practice, and so many Quakers turned against it. And so I wonder if there was a similar religious logic or prohibition on participation in slavery for Jews.
There's definitely different views among the Jewish community, and participation or not in the slave trade is divisive. And I think it's representative of how divisive it was as an issue for all types of people. It's not codified the same way that it is in the Quaker religion, which I think I've also been remiss in studying the Talmud recently, so perhaps it's in there and I've missed it. But a lot of this is really split. And so there are some Jews that participate in the slave trade, that enslave people, that have the slaves in their homes. And there are others that are right from the get-go opposed to this, opposed to participating in it, and are very active in the abolition movement. And then there are others, which I think are the majority, at least until the Civil War, when you kind of have to pick a side, who are sort of in the middle there, who aren't going to participate in it, who maybe don't even have the means to do so, even if they thought this was a good idea, and are just sort of living in this economy that has been built around them, because a lot of that infrastructure was already here when a lot of these Jews arrived in early America. So it's a really complicated, complex issue. And I think we, especially when you're talking about the Civil War, have things in our collection that talk about the Jews that were involved in the Confederacy and that were sort of pro-slavery. I think one of the things that's been really interesting about the last maybe 30 years or so is the historiography and the way we talk about the slave trade shifting to acknowledge what is really an ugly truth in American Jewish history, that it may have been a small number, but it was still an economic travesty that Jewish people did participate in. And so how do we deal with that? How do we reconcile that history? And I think that's still an ongoing question. But I think we've come so far in at least understanding who was involved and acknowledging that Jewish people, while small in number, were still participating in this oppression, exploitation, and oftentimes murder of Black people in what becomes the United States. And that's a really important thing to study and to acknowledge.
And where we see that in the collections, especially in terms of these early colonial collections, is in the family papers, again, specifically in the wills of people, because they are willing people as property. And a lot of times it's not something that's mentioned necessarily in correspondence, but where you see it is in these financial transactions. One of our sort of most famous Revolutionary War and colonial collections we have here, the collection of Mordecai Sheftall, who's from Georgia, it's clear that his family owned at least 5 slaves from the documentation we have. And obviously that's just what we have. There may be other documentation elsewhere that shows that there were more, but it's clear from the archive that they were participants in the slave trade.
Like you said, there's just a lot of similarities between the early American Jewish experience and the larger experience of early America. The story of slavery and participation in enslavement in the slave trade was very much a part of the early American story. And, as we know from our discussions with other scholars, it was a highly divisive issue for many different early American communities. Now, Melanie, I'm glad you brought up the Revolutionary War collections of the American Jewish Historical Society, because right after we take a moment to talk about our episode sponsor, we have some listener questions about Jewish participation in the American Revolution. If this year has taught us anything, it's that tomorrow may not look like today. But Schwab knows that successful financial planning can help propel net worth by 2.7 times. That's why Schwab offers a variety of easy, flexible financial planning options that can rise to meet any of life's many curveballs. Whether it's making a complimentary retirement plan online or chatting directly with a financial consultant, anyone can look forward to planning with Schwab. Learn more at schwab.com/plan.
Hi, I'm Rob Parkinson, Associate Professor of History at Binghamton University, and my new book, 13 Clocks, How Race United the Colonies and Made the Declaration of Independence, published by the Omohundro Institute, is out now. This book covers the 15 months between Lexington and Concord and the Declaration of Independence, and we think we know that story cold. Especially in 1776, it is a straight march from Thomas Paine and common sense through Thomas Jefferson denouncing the king in the Declaration of Independence. What I have found is we have forgotten so much of what happens in those 15 months, and especially about the presence of African Americans and Native Americans in that story, and then worries and opportunities about how we can exploit these fears and use that as a basis for this extremely fragile thing of unity. Get your copy of 13 Clocks, How Race United the Colonies and Made the Declaration of Independence, wherever you buy your books.
And if you'd like more information about Rob's book, 13 Clocks, and where you can purchase a copy, visit benfranklinsworld.com/clocks. That's benfranklinsworld.com/clocks. Melanie, Haley and Mark are very interested in Jewish participation in the American Revolution. Could you tell us generally about Jewish participation in the Revolution and about the different contributions that Jews have made to the founding of the United States?
Absolutely. Obviously, first of all, Jewish Americans did fight on the side of the revolution. We actually have a list in one of the family collections that's a list of Jewish officers, soldiers, and sailors who served in the Revolutionary War, all from the state of New Jersey, or what eventually became the state of New Jersey and those surrounding areas. But we keep running into the same problem in terms of our collections, which is, the very curated perspective that it represents. So, for example, in the Sheftall collection, and also, when you talk about someone like Heim Solomon or Aaron Lopez, what people often don't think about in terms of fighting a war is, yes, you need people to fight in it, but you also need people to finance it because you need to pay these soldiers whatever terrible pittance you're paying them, but they need to be outfitted. They need to be fed. There needs to be munitions. Wars are extremely expensive. And when you're talking about a place that's not even a country yet, that has no organized infrastructure to raise money to outfit an army, so they were looking to private people to help to finance this. And Heim Solomon and Sheftall and Aaron Lopez in particular all helped to finance the war effort in a variety of ways. And certainly for Sheftall and Solomon, it basically bankrupted both of them and their families. Heim Solomon alone raised, I want to say, well over $600,000 back then, which is millions now, to help fight the revolution. And supposedly, according to some sources, the Battle of Yorktown would not have been won if he hadn't raised this big last-ditch burst of money for General Washington to be able to outfit the soldiers. And they were never repaid because, as we know, America, we couldn't repay anybody. We couldn't repay our debt to France. This is a new, democratic experiment. And basically, Heim Solomon died virtually penniless, largely because of all of the money that he had invested in the American Revolution. And Sheftall also ended up never really regaining the fortune that he'd had before. He still kept his community status. He was still active in the community. But, these are people who also were deep believers in the American experiment, who were both members of the Sons of Liberty. Sheftall was referred to as a rabble-rouser, supposedly, by the British. So these were people who were deeply invested in the idea of America and what the revolution was going to promise for the country. And I would assume, for them and their families as well. So there's a variety of different ways to participate. But in our collections here, a great deal of it is documented in their financial contributions. And Sheftall and Solomon are also very colorful people. Sheftall was imprisoned at one point on a Navy prison ship off the harbor in, I believe, Savannah. He escaped, was able to go to Philadelphia. The entire history of the Sheftall family and their long history is actually contained in the finding aid for the collection. And the collection itself is also fully digitized. So anyone can look at all of these documents, including his actual account books for everything that he was providing to the army, all these provisions. He was essentially functioning as a quartermaster before that was, a function that was really codified into that military structure.
Mark would really love more details about the story of Heim Solomon. But before we dig deeper into Solomon's story, I have a question about networks. You mentioned that there were a lot of prominent Jews who were financing and bankrolling the American Revolution and really helping to bring ammunition to the shores of North America for the use of the Continental Army. And one of the big depots or places where the rebellious Americans received gunpowder from was the Dutch free trade island of St. Eustatius. It's an island in the Caribbean. And I've been fortunate enough to visit Statia, or the Golden Rock as it was called, because it was such a valuable island. And when you go into the downtown area, you'll see the ruins of Statia's Jewish synagogue and bathhouse from the 17th and 18th centuries. So when you mentioned gunpowder, Melanie, my brain clicked into the fact that there is this larger Jewish Atlantic world, that there is this larger Jewish Atlantic trade network. And I'm curious, did American Jews tap into this, Jewish Atlantic world to help finance the American Revolution?
Well, a lot of these families, obviously, and this is borne out in the genealogies we have in the archives and whatnot, they all knew each other. They were part of the same social networks. A lot of them were also Masons in the same Masonic lodges. They were, members of the same fraternal organizations. And they also were all marrying each other. Within the Solis Cohen collection, for example, you look at their genealogy and it's a who's who. It's the Cardozos, the Eddings, the Menkins, the Nathans, all of these families who came relatively early and became relatively affluent and were probably invested in what was going to happen in the revolution and saw this as an opportunity. And so they're all leveraging their connections that way, I would say. And that's how I think some of those networks were functioning.
Now, to return to Heim Solomon, Melanie, you spoke earlier of Heim Solomon's great financial contributions to the War for Independence. And Mark adds that in addition to Solomon's financial contributions, he also worked as a spy during the American Revolution. Could you tell us more about this interesting aspect of Heim Solomon's contributions to the American Revolution?
Yes. Supposedly he was a spy, and this was very early on. This was like 1776, but then he was pardoned. But then they detained him for 18 months on a boat to be an interpreter because the British obviously had hired a lot of Hessians, so German fighters for hire, and Solomon knew German. So he was functioning as, supposedly a translator, but also was supposedly helping people escape, was encouraging the Hessians to leave the British war effort, and was acting as sort of this covert saboteur. And eventually he was let go, but then he was arrested again, convicted of espionage, and sentenced to death. But he escaped, obviously survived the war, and again, sadly died very young. He died, I believe, at age 45, virtually penniless due to his support of the American war effort. But yes, he was a very active and colorful participant in, the American revolutionary activities, I would say. And actually, one of the things that's interesting is in the collection that we have of his family, almost all of it is family material. There's very little about the revolution. Almost all of the revolutionary materials are posthumous and have to do with his family petitioning the United States government to honor their debts and saying, you've impoverished our family. We've supported the government. We put in all this money and here he's gone. He can't do it himself. What will you do for the family? And that is included in the collection as well. So when he died, this was pretty unsettled. And his contributions, I think, were not really yet honored in the way that they are now or studied in the same way.
One place that has kept popping up throughout our conversation is the Torah Synagogue in Newport, Rhode Island. And Haley notes that George Washington exchanged letters with the Torah Synagogue. So, Gemma, could you tell us more about this synagogue and the Newport, Rhode Island Jewish community, and about Washington's correspondence with this community?
This is a really fun question because I think there's a lot of mythology around George Washington in general. Everything about him is sort of mythologized, but especially, his relationship with the Jewish community in Newport was not something he initiated. Newport is one of the oldest Jewish communities in America at this point, made up predominantly of Jews who descended from people who fled the Spanish Inquisition. So this is still a pretty small number. During the Revolution, I think Newport was home to about 30 to 35 Jewish families. So we're talking about a couple hundred people at most, depending on the size of the family. And so Torah Synagogue is established around 1762, 1763. And in 1790, George Washington comes to Newport, Rhode Island for a visit. So he gets there. There's great fanfare. Everybody's very excited to see him. He arrives on the evening of August 17th. And by the next morning, he's got letters from multiple community leaders in town. And that includes Torah Synagogue's leader, Moses Seixas. And so Moses is concerned about advocating for religious freedom because the Bill of Rights was being currently debated at that point, and very hotly so. So he believes that he needs to get to George Washington in order to communicate the Jewish community's needs for religious freedom for all, not just those who are different sects of Christian. And so this means a lot to the Torah community because George Washington actually responds to Moses's letter and pledges religious freedom for all. It famously says, give to bigotry no sanction, which is, oft repeated by many politicians over many years in relation to religious freedom and religious persecution. And if I'm not mistaken, to this day, on the anniversary of receiving the letter, the Torah Synagogue does a reading still this many centuries later because it means so much to them to get this response. And I think the letter is really impactful on George Washington. It's not that he didn't show care for the Jewish people before. I don't think it was necessarily something he really thought about at all. And so having, their leader of the synagogue reach out to him and have him respond and start this relationship, I think was really critical in that fight to maintain religious freedom in the Americas. And that ebbs and flows over the decades following it. But at least in that, George Washington era, they have a really close relationship. And again, it's still read aloud on its anniversary today. I think it can't be underestimated how much that influence on ratifying the Bill of Rights it had, and not everybody in Rhode Island necessarily cared about this as much. And so it was really up to these religious communities, not just Jewish, but others, to advocate for themselves in this way.
Before we move into the time warp, I'm curious if there's anything about the Jewish presence in early America that you'd really like people to know, that you'd really like us to walk away with. So let's start with you, Gemma.
I think even just establishing that Jews were there is really important, and that it wasn't an easy road. It was better than an inquisition. It was better than potentially being tortured or killed or forced to convert or go into hiding or lose family members because you refuse to convert. Conversion is not always an option. And so I think it's all kind of relative. And so they find this religious freedom in this new place, but they still have to deal with anti-Semitism. And I think in spite of that, these communities start to really grow and thrive. And the United States is home to one of the largest Jewish populations in the world today. And I think that's largely because of the roots that were established by these Sephardic communities back in the colonial era.
Yes. Everything Gemma said. But I guess what I would say is that it's also a very rich and interesting history, and one that can't be separated from the overall history of the early American Republic. That's, I think, the key piece that every time I look at these collections, that's always brought home for me, like how deeply involved the people in these communities were with the Revolutionary War effort, but really in establishing what is now America. These are people that were here from the very beginning. And that was something that the earliest founders of the Ajhs were very, very interested in documenting for basically that very reason, to say Jewish people are not new in America as of 1892, that Jewish people have been here for as long as other European people have been here and have been contributors to America for as long as the colonies have been here. And I think that that's really important.
Great. Thank you. And now we should move into the time warp. This is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently, or if someone had acted differently. In your opinion, what might have happened if Jews had not migrated to early North America? How would early American history and early United States history be different?
It's funny because I've been thinking about this for a couple of days, and I don't think it was until I was refreshing my memory about the Torah Synagogue that I really felt like maybe it would have really been different if those Jewish communities had not migrated as early as they did. We're talking about a difference of 140 years. So, the first Jews come in 1654. The Torah Synagogue is 1763. And we're talking about the Bill of Rights in 1790. And it's this really long history. But the people in that Newport community, because they had those roots and those family roots in the Spanish Inquisition, and because they were so, I think, worried about religious persecution and that they might have to go back to that time or that place where their ancestors, which at this point was just a generation or two, it wasn't that long before, were being forced to convert or being expelled or being killed. I think that advocacy to establish religious freedom, I do think maybe the conversation would have been different if those Jewish communities had not been there for the last 100, 150 years before that conversation started to really be debated and take shape as the Bill of Rights took shape.
Yeah, I would concur on that. I think that that's absolutely true because obviously, you have people of variety of different religious persuasions moving here for religious freedom, but a lot of that was largely centered around Christians and around the freedom to worship as Protestants and very specific types of Protestants who wanted to practice a very particular type of Protestantism. But also, when you do have these early Jewish communities which are established, which then gives them a certain amount of capital within their communities, that then they're able to move that conversation forward with someone like George Washington, who's then in a position to say, you know what? Yeah, we need to maybe change, or we need to think a little differently about some of these ideas about religious liberty. And that, I think, is really probably the big one, I would say, the biggest piece.
Does the American Jewish Historical Society have any programs, events, or exhibitions coming up that we should know about? And make a point of come seeing?
We got a couple of things. So we have a regular series, which is now being presented virtually, and we're hoping that we'll be back in person as well, although we'll still continue to stream it, which is our At Lunch series with Julie Solomon, who's a wonderful reporter and friend to the American Jewish Historical Society, where she just interviews members of the Jewish community. And so that, I think, is something to keep looking forward to. And hopefully we can invite people onto our campus and through our doors to hear that in person soon, but it'll all be streamed and continues to be streamed. And we have an exhibit coming up on the history of Union Square, which initially starts with the story of Emma Lazarus, one of our favorite collections here at Ajhs, and talks about the political importance of Union Square in New York City as a place of gathering, as a pulpit, as all of these things that activists of the time, poets like Emma, that they use to get their message out. And so we'll have that exhibit. And I do think it'll be interesting because, so, we talked about Peter Stuyvesant earlier, and Stuyvesant Town is just across from Union Square. And so I think there's actually something really nice about having this exhibit about this place and the power of Jewish politics and Jewish writers and others like Frederick Douglass essentially being right across from this place named after this person who wanted to expel all Jews from the region. Like, he didn't succeed. His name might be on that building, but we're about to have an exhibit that talks about their ability to be resilient and advocate for themselves and others right here in that same neighborhood. So I'm very excited about that.
Yes, that is going to be a great exhibit. Also, as the head librarian and archivist of the Ajhs, I would be remiss if I also didn't say that our reading room is reopened and we are open for researchers, and any and all of the collections and materials that we talked about are accessible through our reading room, and a huge amount of them are also available digitally, so you can look at them without even getting up off of your couch. But we're very, very happy to be able to reopen to researchers after the long closure of the pandemic.
It's like you read my mind, because I was just going to ask you, Melanie, about access to the American Jewish Historical Society's collections and whether the society was a place where we could come and do research and ask questions about our early American or Jewish American ancestors.
Yes, we are part of the Center for Jewish History. That is the building that we are housed in. And part of the services that are offered through the reference department and the reading room is an incredible genealogy institute. They are not taking walk-ins right now, but they are also operating virtually and can help people with their family histories, whether you're researching American Jewish history or European Jewish history. And the reading room to look at collection material, whether it's genealogy material or material for any other research, is open by appointment 3 days a week. And we expect that to go up to 4 days a week shortly.
Where's the best place to reach you if we have more questions about the Jewish presence in early America? How can we get in contact with you?
Our website. So if you go to ajhs.org, you'll be able to get in touch with a researcher, with one of us, and we'll be able to help you out.
Gemma Birnbaum and Melanie Meyers, thank you for joining us and for introducing us to the American Jewish Historical Society and to early American Jewish history.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
It is nearly impossible to separate Jewish history from the founding of the United States. Jews contributed to the colonization of North America and supported the revolutionaries' call during the American Revolution with both their money and their lives. The Jewish presence in North America began in 1654, when a handful of families migrated from Portuguese-controlled Brazil to the Dutch trading center of New Amsterdam, modern-day New York City. As Gemma and Melanie informed us, Jews settled throughout British North America, establishing communities in nearly every colonial port city and building farms in southern agricultural areas. Like many colonists, Jews came to North America for economic and religious reasons. Chief among their reasons for settling in North America was to escape religious persecution. Living in Dutch and British-controlled colonies afforded Jews safety from the Spanish and Portuguese Inquisitions. Now, although they escaped the Inquisitions, Jews still faced anti-Semitism wherever they settled. As Gemma and Melanie revealed, non-Jewish Americans harbored anti-Jewish views and sometimes used those views to discriminate against their Jewish neighbors. But early American Jews proved resilient and went about establishing their communities, neighborhoods, and places of worship. They also did their best to fit into the larger colonial communities in which they resided. They started businesses, conducted trade, married and had children, and contributed to the economic success of early America. And when the call to revolution echoed throughout the 13 British North American colonies, early American Jews answered it. They joined the Continental Army and Navy, their state militias, and they offered their trade connections and money to help keep the American war effort afloat. Jews helped build the world that became the United States, and their long history and presence in North America cannot be separated from the story of the American Republic, nor can it be separated from the many other experiences and histories of early North America. For more information about the American Jewish Historical Society, its manuscript and digital collections, as well as its special events and programs, visit the show notes page, benfranklinsworld.com/317. Please remember to tell your friends and family about Ben Franklin's World. Your word-of-mouth support really goes a long way. This episode of Ben Franklin's World is supported by an American Rescue Plan grant to the Omohundro Institute from the National Endowment for the Humanities. Production assistance for this podcast comes from the Omohundro Institute's digital audio team: Joseph Edelman, Jessica Brabble, Martha Howard, and Holly White. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. To discover and listen to their other podcasts, visit airwavemedia.com. Finally, what other aspects of the Jewish experience in early America would you like to know about? Help me plan future episodes. Liz at benfranklinsworld.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute and is sponsored by the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation.